Hey everybody, Nathan Fowkes here, and I promised you guys a rant, but with solutions about the rules of color temperature, so let's do it. So let me show you, we'll just go to our sphere here because I'm a concept artist, but I try and teach a class every week, and over the years off and on, I've taught a portrait painting class, and so this is a warm-up exercise here. And I had a student many years ago. She was painting along and she was doing this. Here, let me show you. Her shadows, she was painting them like electric blue. I mean, oh my gosh, this is almost not an exaggeration of how far she was going with it. So I looked over her shoulder and I said, wow, that's quite the impressive blue you have going on in the shadows. What's your thinking on that? And she said, well, you know, so-and-so, one of my favorite artists said, warm light means cool shadows. So, well, so-and-so artist is also one of my favorite artists, the person that she mentioned. So much so that many years previous, I had actually taken a workshop with this particular artist. And whatever he happened to have said, I'm quite sure that this is not what he meant. And yet she was literally going this extreme. Well, I know most of you out there aren't going to do this, of course. You know, God bless her, she was a young artist just at the very beginning of the learning curve. But over the years, I can't tell you, over and over, I have heard people say warm light means cool shadows and cool light means warm shadows. Is that true? Is it always true? And if it's not always true, when would it not be true and why? We have got to know. So let me jump back to the ranch here. And by the way, if you'll stick with me till the end, I've got an exercise for you that's going to help you really fine-tune your color relationship skills so that you don't become the one that at some far future date we're mocking behind your back in a YouTube video. And by the way, just so you can brace yourself for it, we're going to spend a full 20 minutes on this tutorial to dig in and do it right. Okay, so for my oil painting demonstration here, the light is very warm, a warm spotlight. We're trying to mimic sunlight. It was a night class. And so sure enough, the shadows do have a cool cast to them. Here's a quick demo from my gouache sketching class. And again, we have very warm light, and the shadows overall do have a cool cast to them. So far, so good. Let's keep going with this. Same warm-up exercise, but this time trying to mimic cool light. What would it look like with lighting on an overcast day or under a skylight where you have very cool light coming down? Well, to do this, we were looking at one of the great portrait painters, a sketch from John Singer Sargent, where he was sketching his father under a skylight. And sure enough, we have cool light giving us the feeling, the cast of very warm shadows. We're doing great here. That rule that's been passed around is holding up pretty well. So another demo from my gouache sketching class. And now, same very warm spotlight, but the shadows are feeling quite warm and aren't really feeling cool. So we're not really getting the rule this time around. And then here's another one. The shadows are very warm, not really any cool at all here. Warm light, no cool shadow. What is going on here? And how about this one? Very warm light. And not only are the shadows not cool, I mean, they are glowing hot. Well, I don't know, maybe I just don't know what I'm doing. But I'm hoping to convince you that I do. So let's look at objects in the environment. Let's look at a little bit of landscape sketching. Sketch out at the Grand Canyon in gouache. And so the quote-unquote rule seems to be holding up here. Warm light, overall cool shadows. Here's another landscape sketch. Well, these shadows aren't cool at all. They're quite warm. So let's peek at one more landscape here. This is an iconic building in Rome. And it's primarily in shadow. We have very warm late afternoon light. And some of the shadows are quite cool, warm light, cool shadows. But some of the shadow areas, quite a bit of them, are just hot. I'll zoom in on it a bit here for you. We have some kind of middle temperature shadows here. We have very cold shadows here. We have super hot, really hot shadows happening through here. But then we're getting into some cold shadows here. So obviously, a one-sentence rule about what light is falling far short for us. Now I know that many of you out there are somewhat experienced, maybe very, and you're saying, well, of course, Nathan, you know, atmospheric light, skylight, bounce light, and you're very correct. But some of you are very early in the learning curve. You've heard some of these so-called rules, and it's very tempting within the just crippling complexity of how hard all this stuff gets to grab on to a simple formula that's going to help you solve these problems. A formula like warm light means cool shadows, and cool shadows means warm light. But all of this to lay out all of the situations where it is not working for us. We've got to solve this. So back to a lit sphere, let's just start with this. So let's burn and dodge it, and let's turn it into a sphere, kind of that overcast day kind of a feel that we looked at before. Now let's add our direct light source. But there is something missing here. This is the effect of sunlight, a warmed up version of it anyway. And so light will come down, hit the surface here, and then bounce up into the shadow. So what this is missing is bounce light. So let's drop that in. You see that little bit of light coming in around the bottom there? So now we're good. Do we have warm light and cool shadows? Well, I don't know that we would necessarily call these cool shadows. The cast shadow feels a little bit relatively cool because it doesn't have any of that warming bounce light in it. Well, if we are mimicking sunlight, we're possibly missing one other thing, to state the obvious: skylight. If there's nothing overhead blocking it, then blue light will come straight down from the sky. So let's add that in. Okay, there we go. Now we have our cool shadows, at least in some areas, but specifically a product of cool skylight. But let me also stress the influence of color relationships. The fact that this is a very warm light causes the shadow to feel cool by contrast with it. Let's push that idea. Let's say for whatever reason we're in a very warm environment. With that additional quality of warmth by contrast, it does help the shadows feel very cold. Warm light, cold shadows. Now let's do the opposite. We'll take the warm environment away and we'll put a very cold environment around there. And now, instead of the shadows feeling icy cold like they did a moment ago, well, they still have cool notes in them, but they feel much warmer relative to the cold environment. So whatever's next to a color can have a major influence on it. Warm light does not mean cool shadows. And of course, objects can be all sorts of different colors. We call that local color, the color of the object. The color of the object itself can have a major influence. Here's a blue version. And so shadows are simply a darker version of whatever the local color of the object is, plus any other lighting influences. In this case, bounce light and cool atmospheric light. So you see those exact same lighting effects happening here with the direct light, the bounce light, the cool atmospheric light. And then in a quick landscape sketch, you see exactly those same things indicated. And that's how I paint quickly. I try and indicate those lighting plane changes. The direct light, the cool light hitting the top planes in the shadow, the warm bounce light hitting whatever planes are facing it. And that gives us form. And it also gives us a very rich color palette because warms and cools have a fantastic and luminous contrast. And if you'll allow, this image is brought to you courtesy of DesignStudioPress.com, the publisher of my book. You see this is taken directly out of the page of my landscape sketching book, so you guys thought this was going to be commercial free, but I promise. Let's get to the helpful stuff. Let's jump to this because we now know that we have two things happening. We have the idea that colors influence the adjacent colors. For instance, this bluish gray square and this reddish gray square are both in fact exactly the same gray. It is why, in some circumstances, the warm light can cause the shadows to feel cool. But here's the rant, I'll keep it to one sentence. Can we all please stop saying that? Warm light means cool shadow means warm light, or I don't even, just ends up working against us to the point where some of my students have even done this. So let's just stick to trying to understand color relationships and to the simple understanding of what light really does. So let's put a pin in color relationships for now. How about we do another little YouTube tutorial on how to take advantage of and use color relationships? Because I know how you guys are, this little YouTube talk has already gone too long. And I'm busy too, so let's just wrap up with a few examples of color relationship influences and the simple relationship of direct light, bounce light, and atmospheric light. Because that's exactly what's happening in this very quick sketch that has fairly warm shadows except where the skylight hits. And for color relationships, there was not a dark green backdrop here, but I thought by putting a little bit of green into a dark value, that would let the rich warms really pop because I didn't have a lot of time to paint. I had to get an immediate statement. Another class demo where we had some fun with the lighting, and with all of that hot light, yeah, the cool notes that we brought into the shadow were very pronounced. But had we used a cool light, those very same cool feeling shadows do have some real heat in them. And I had so much fun with this one, just playing with these little color relationships, because a simple understanding of what light does and how colors contrast with each other opens up that world. It also lets us deal with the incredible complexities of light and shadow in complex subjects. And let's bring it back around to what's important to most of you out there, because it's fine if you're not a portrait painter or a landscape painter. And if you don't mind taking a close look, you can see everything that we've just talked about at play. And I've been ranting against the quote-unquote rule this whole time because it would have killed this and the previous images that I've just showed you. So let's take a closer look then. For instance, you can really see the bounce light and direct light that we were just talking about, the underside of these branches, picking up that warm bounce light coming from below. And there's a variety of different local colors filling this in and giving us that rich variety. Now let's come down here because we have dappled light coming in, direct sunlight peeking through the branches and hitting here and there. But the rest of the subject here is illuminated by cool light. Uh-oh, we have warm light, means cool shadow, but we have cool light, meaning warm shadow, happening at the same time on the same thing. We're in trouble. Except we're not, because we understand how things really work, with the highlight being a little warmer as a product of the warm light source and then the local color of the object. The bounce light coming up in here really warms it up. It kind of neutralizes that blue and gives a relative warm feeling. And then the cool skylight is not as influential here because of that cool local color already existing. And so we use that. For instance, right here, that's exactly what's happening, where we have that direct light hitting and giving us that combination of warm light and cool local color. But then right next to it, we have cool skylight coming through. and doing its thing on the cool local color. And as we wrap around to the underside, well, we have all of that rich bounce light, just like what we saw in the sphere, the warm light coming up and neutralizing those blues feeling warm, and also a greenishness. Hey, maybe warm light means green shadows. Nah, I'm just being smart now. No, it's a product of the light bouncing off of this green local color and bringing that quality here. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out, we have cool skylight coming down and hitting the top planes in here, hitting that very warm yellow-green moss. Also happening a little bit over here. It has a lot of cool light influence, but it still feels vividly warm because of that local color, but also because it's surrounded by these adjacent blues, which help it feel more richly warm by contrast. Hence our two considerations: understanding the interaction of light and object, and also understanding that colors have a relative effect on each other. Okay, so here's your homework assignment. Using the format below, create 4 different scenarios where colors appear identical when surrounded by other colors, but are noticeably different when placed side by side. Scenario 1, hue. And by that I mean, take 2 slightly different color hues and surround them by colors that make them look identical to each other. Then do the same thing, 2 different saturations but make them look the same. Scenario 3, temperature, warmer, cooler, but make them look the same. And then scenario 4, try and do all of them together at the same time. You got to do this. It's going to help fine-tune your color sensibilities. It's also going to have you pulling your hair out. And by the way, if you aren't completely familiar with our terminology here, hue, saturation, value, visually this is what those things mean. And this slide that we looked at earlier is a clue as to how you might approach these solutions. And post your results on your Twitter account and tag me. I would love to have a look. So as always, I want to wish you the very best for your artwork.